Get started here in just a moment. Thank you all for coming for day 2 of our Mountain West Regional Conference. I'm going to just wait till a couple more people show up. Hello, welcome. All right, well, thank you so much for all of you here today. It's great to see you again for our day 2 of the Mountain West Regional Conference. And wow, what a great first day we had. So appreciate all of you making the effort to be here. And again, my name is Bill Barron. I'm the Mountain West Regional Coordinator, and it's great to see you all. I like that. Thanks for cheering me on. Yeah. Woo! Thank you. So tonight, this morning, I'm really excited to hear Logan speak about the convergence of climate urgency and opportunity. And Logan, he is an energy analyst and atmospheric scientist. He works for Utah Clean Energy, but more so than anything else, he's a dear friend of mine. So it's really great to have Logan here. He was, during COVID, he was my bubble. So every Sunday we would get together and hang out outside, rain, shine, snow, sleeping bags, the whole works to be able to stay outside and hang out. So that was a really wonderful experience for me. And then the rest of the conference, the way it's going to work is we're going to have a breakout session after Logan's keynote. And we'll have in this room, we will have the What is Decarbonization, the University of Utah Health Experience. And then in room 316, we will have How to Make Advocacy Super Fun with the amazing Montana team. And then we're also excited to have Mark Peterson, who is our state coordinator, co-state coordinator in Utah, doing clean energy. It's happening, and that's going to be in room 320 across the way. Again, restrooms are over in this direction. We have coffee. We're really excited to have you. And with that, I will pass it off to you, Logan. Oh, and I should say thanks again to our sponsors. Protect Our Winners and Climate Action Guide were our peak sponsors this year and really helped us put this conference together. So thanks.
Good morning. It's times like these when I wish I had a background as a pastor or something so they could channel that Sunday morning energy, get people to wake up and look a little louder for the back. Okay. All right. How is that? Is that better? Great. Are any of you going to see the eclipse tomorrow somewhere? We'll see about half of it here, but I don't know. I've been hearing a lot of people who are like flying to somewhere to go see the eclipse tomorrow. This photo here is of the annular eclipse that we had here in Utah last October. So I went down to the middle of the desert and took this photo. It's really cool experience. And it's not a perfect metaphor for this talk, but it's even though it's slightly tortured, I'll still use it. What's cool about eclipses is that you get this alignment of celestial bodies, and at a time when we're usually used to seeing, it's daytime, it should be light, it gets really dark, and it's this convergence of these bodies, and it's a very special thing. But it's special because you're expecting one thing, but you're getting another. And so it's, yeah, as I said, it's a little bit of a tortured analogy, but right now we're at the convergence of urgency and opportunity and climate change. And that's what I want to talk about today. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction and for the invite to be here this morning. As he said, I'm a climate scientist and energy analyst. I did my PhD at Oregon State studying drilling for ice cores and measuring greenhouse gases in ice cores. Came out to Utah about a decade ago and was a professor at the University of Utah looking at urban air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. So I come to this space from a background of climate science and understanding the climate system, paleoclimate, long-term climate change, and where we are today and where we're going in the future. And about 2 years ago, I joined a nonprofit called Utah Clean Energy. And because I wanted to get it was actually CCL that helped me understand that there was an urgency about communicating about climate change and that more folks needed to understand the science. And CCL helped give me the tools to talk to policymakers and made me realize that it's actually really necessary. At Utah Clean Energy, we work on many of the pieces, not all of the pieces, but many of the pieces from a state focused perspective. So we work on transforming homes and buildings to become zero emission. We work on electric transportation, and I work in the utility space and working on mobilizing key stakeholders and leaders in Utah to focus on the climate challenge and climate solutions. This talk is really about, as I've been working on this topic, this quote has come up a number of times, and I feel like it's a useful jumping off point. And it's from F. Scott Fitzgerald from almost a century ago. Said the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in our minds at the same time and retain the ability to function. That is critical. And that's where we find ourselves right now. On the one hand, the climate is changing and we're seeing increasingly devastating impacts on society. Every 1/10 of a degree of warming matters and increases the costs and the risks of climate change. But on the other hand, and at the very same time, we're in the middle of a clean energy revolution that's at the scale of the Industrial Revolution, which is going to play out in a couple of decades instead of a century. So my goal today is to walk you through both of these divergent realities, talk about where we're at today, where we're heading, and both here in our region and around the world. And really, this is a communications talk. Many of you already know all of this information that I'm going to tell you. What you should be thinking about is how to talk to other people about this. And because the more times you hear it, the more you're like, oh, that was useful. That little piece of it, I could do this, or so-and-so needs to hear this piece of it. So that's what I really want you to be listening for. So let's start with the climate impacts part of this. We're seeing the rate of temperature increases is really astounding. We've known that temperatures are going up, but 2023, the global temperatures were quite literally off the charts. And I'll talk more about this and the details of this in a little bit. It seems like, and it is true, almost every day, somewhere there's a new climate record. They just keep falling, one after the other. Last summer, especially across the world, and we're still seeing this ongoing through today, there are massive coral bleaching events. In last year, it was really focused on the tropical Atlantic. Right now, we're seeing it in the Great Barrier Reef. We're seeing them in we're seeing that in a lot of places. This is really important because 1 billion people rely on fish as their primary protein source. And these coral reef ecosystems are the primary place where people are getting that protein from. Insurance is like the canary in the coal mine in terms of climate impacts. we're seeing home insurers cut their coverage of natural disasters as the climate risks grow. And this is true for home insurance, for flood insurance. We're seeing it for wildfire insurance. We're also seeing it for wildfire insurance for utilities. Insurance is in the game of protecting against risks, and we're seeing those risks and costs grow. And so they're actually saying, we're pulling back. This is the first domino to fall. And in terms of the economic impacts, CCL is really focused on carbon pricing and the economic impacts of climate change. This is one of the key pieces of that, one of the first dominoes. Last summer was, thankfully, in the central to southern US, we didn't have quite as bad of wildfire season as we've had in years past. But in Canada, they had a crazy wildfire season, one of the worst they've ever experienced. And they were so severe that the wildfires they never put them out. And I went back and checked in on this story. So that was last summer when they thought these wildfires they might just burn straight through the winter. And I just checked, and yep, they're still burning. The wildfires never went out. They just moved underground. They're now calling them zombie wildfires. And so this talk is, these are kind of some North American impacts and global impacts. And then what I often do in these talks is I zero into our local region. And so for those of you who aren't in Utah, recognize that this talk is oriented towards Utah policymakers, but these kinds of stories exist in every single state and everywhere in the country. So I talk about climate impacts where we are here locally. And to talk about this, I'm actually going to use as a tool this report that came out a few years ago about the health impacts of climate change. And they broke the health impacts of climate change out into different categories: extreme heat, outdoor air quality, flooding, vector-borne infection, water-related infection, food-related infection, and mental health. And we're seeing basically every single one of these in our region. For example, extreme heat. A couple years ago, Salt Lake City had 34 days that were over 100 degrees in a summer. These are wild. It's never happened before. Outdoor air quality, of course, we just talked about wildfire impacts. Even though this is from last summer, and even though the wildfires were in Canada, the smoke blows down and blows across the whole US. The East Coast had terrible air quality from wildfire smoke this year. So there was actually a lot of more coverage about it because it was affecting New York and the big East Coast cities. And wildfire smoke travels a long distance. We get wildfire smoke here from Siberia, from Siberian wildfires at times. Flooding, of course, has major impacts as climate change increases the atmosphere's capacity to hold water. We're seeing more intense flooding events as well as drought events. And so here's, last summer we had, Moab had a 100-year flood, but it actually it's happening more often now. Those statistics are changing. And of course, we're also dealing with the drying of the Great Salt Lake. Vector-borne diseases, we're seeing more of those travel further north into places where they didn't exist before. So here's a story about Lyme-carrying ticks and other pests that are expanding their range north because of climate change. Waterborne infection. Last summer and in many, we're seeing this increasingly commonly throughout Utah now, where we have a lot of water bodies that have harmful algal blooms. Of course, warmer temperatures make those harmful algal blooms more common, and that's one of the key ingredients for a harmful algal bloom. And then I don't have a good reference for foodborne infection, but of course those can happen. Thankfully, we have a lot of tools in place to deal with foodborne infection in a developed country. That's more of a concern in developing countries. But mental health and well-being, there's a lot of folks who are worried about our future. And so there's a lot of work on that as well. So that gives you a sense of the impacts of climate change. We're feeling them already here. at the warming that we've already experienced, and things are only getting worse. At the very same time, solutions are ramping up. This is our utility is Rocky Mountain Power, and their owner is PacifiCorp. This was their plan as of a year ago to build out new clean energy resources and scale down coal and natural gas. Now, this, as of last week, there's actually been a setback, a major setback with this, because of the wildfires that are occurring. Our utility is facing a lot of lawsuits and legal liability, and they've actually, because of this and a few other things, they're actually scaling back their plans to ramp up these clean energy, which illustrates that we need to keep working on these issues. It's not going to come easily. We have to keep working on them. There is a lot of innovation and scale in clean energy, and there's some really, really exciting things going on. Two of the ones that I really like to highlight are the stuff that's happening in geothermal and batteries. In terms of geothermal, there's some, I think it's the most exciting story in energy in the world, and it's happening in Utah, in our region. We have a pilot DOE-funded project in South Central Utah and Beaver, Utah, that is exploring enhanced geothermal. And it's a way to produce geothermal basically anywhere. You don't have to do it in places where you already have existing hydrothermal systems. You can basically build these things anywhere. And then a private company has come in and started to develop that technology. And they've, over the last year, they've seen a 70% reduction in drilling times, which is the main component. It's one of the main components of their costs of that system. They've seen a 70% reduction in drilling times. So that's like half the cost of developing that resource. Massive, massive increases. PacifiCorp had been planning, until a week ago, they had been planning to build out 8 gigawatts of battery storage. And to put that in perspective, just a couple of years ago, the entire country had about 1.5 gigawatts of battery storage. Now, PacifiCorp's plans as of a week ago got scaled way back, but they're not changing the economics of how things are changing. And I think that we'll get to this 8 gigawatt number regardless. We can leverage all of that clean energy to decarbonize our buildings and transportation. So this is one of the ways that I like to show this is looking at 2 different kinds of buildings here in Utah. On the left is a typical home. It's a 2,700 square foot home that has dual fuel. So it's partially electric and just for normal stuff. And then it's got natural gas for your heating and water heater, basically. And if you look at 2023, and on the right is an all-electric home that is fully electric and energy efficient. And if you look at 2023, you can see that an all-electric home already decreases your emissions from that home by a little bit. But as our electric system gets cleaner, that all-electric home has a much larger reduction in overall emissions because our electricity system is decarbonizing. And you'll never get rid of those emissions from that furnace and the water heater over there, because natural gas appliances never get more efficient in terms of how they're operating. If you take another step back and think about the embedded emissions of those resources, it actually looks a lot worse because natural gas has upstream leakage of natural gas is 95% methane. It's really just methane gas. And in Utah, we have a lot of leakage. It's one of the few places where we have some good monitoring. And we can actually see that there's a lot of methane leakage from the upstream oil and gas production regions. And if you add those emissions onto your consumption, it actually doubles the residential emissions. And so it just really illustrates how much you can reduce your emissions by switching over to fully electric. Of course, in the last couple of years, there's been some amazing fundamental advances and investments in clean energy. With the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act, we're seeing investments all across the country in new facilities. We're bringing manufacturing back, building jobs, and it's just this amazing success story. And of course, it's not just in the US, it's all around the world that this is happening. Global investment in clean energy is widening the gap over fossil fuels and accelerating. We're seeing electric vehicle adoption accelerate across the country or across the world. Here in the middle is China, and they're ramping up their EV adoption. This is in 2022. They were about to pass 30% of new vehicle sales were all electric. And in the US, we're a little further behind, but those numbers are increasing rapidly. We think that China has passed peak gasoline in terms of their gasoline usage because they've been ramping up electric vehicles so quickly. And we're already seeing this, the global leader in EV adoption is, of course, Norway. They were close to 90% EV sales last year. And if you look at this chart, it's really instructive about how fast things are changing. 2010, they were basically at 0. And 13 years later, they're at like 90%. 90% of new vehicles are all electric. It can flip on a dime. Here in Utah, we're at about, we just crossed 8% last year. And the critical threshold is crossing 5%. Once you've crossed 5%, then there starts to be enough of a market that people are seeing them around and people start thinking about it like, hey, my next vehicle could be electric. That's the critical threshold for technology adoption and ramping up. So that's really good news. Things are changing fast, but we have a lot more to go. We have a lot to do. The way I like to think about this from a scientific perspective, I feel like this is really where the rubber meets the road. This is global greenhouse gas emissions through history. And you can see where we are at today and where we need to go to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. The way to think about this graph is that when we're high up on the graph, this is our annual emissions per year. When we're high up on the graph, that is kicking the climate system harder. It's causing faster warming, which leads to higher costs and higher risk. And fundamentally, our goal is to move down on this graph as fast as possible to get to a stable climate system with lower risk and lower cost. Yeah. I mean, I think you just, so the question was, beyond just insurance costs and loss of property and life, what other costs are there? Yeah. I think you identified the buckets and I think that so let me come back to that in just a minute. Put a pin in that. And if I don't answer it, raise your hand again. So that's our fundamental goal is to move downwards on this graph to get, and it's important to keep in mind that when I mean stable climate, I don't mean the same climate that we were in. I mean a climate that has stabilized and will be at a warmer temperature, but hopefully not changing, because it's the change in the climate system that is difficult for societal adaptation. But the thing to keep in mind here is there is a huge gap. That red triangle up there, that's the current country-based contributions or what they've committed to in terms of emission reduction. There's a huge gap between where countries have committed their emissions or where they think their emissions are going to go and where we need to be in order to realize this, keeping warming under a certain level. It's a huge gap. And the risk in getting to I'm going to get to this in just a second, but the risk is that we're going to cross climate tipping points. And this is just one of them. There have been a lot of studies. And so my background is a glaciologist. and I've been to Antarctica twice. One of the big risks that we face is from sea level rise. And the concern is that we've already crossed tipping points where even if we can stabilize climate change, the ice sheets have passed a point which they're going to catastrophically fail, or not catastrophically, but they will continue to melt for centuries into the future and raise sea level rise. And that has cascading impacts across society. Scientists are raising the alarm, and many scientists are very alarmed at what we're seeing because we're also human. And even though we can see the models and many of the projections are, many of the things that are happening are in line with what has been projected years ago, it's still different to experience it. And that's the difference of looking at data and understanding narrative. So these are just a few quotes from different prominent scientists who are involved in different aspects. But what we're seeing this year is just the tip of the iceberg of what we expect to happen. The impacts are frighteningly more impactful than I and many other scientists had expected. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe says we're in uncharted territory in terms of the history of human civilization on this planet. If we don't halt warming soon, then the extreme events that we see this year will pale against the ones that are to come. And this gets to your question about like, what are these additional costs? Like some of them we don't fully fundamentally know. It takes imagination, understanding how societies are interconnected, and systemic collapse of systems is, you try to put a number on that and you just can't. It's like, what is the value of a city? Like, what is the value of New Orleans? How do you put a number on that if it's flooded and gone? The costs are going to be astronomical. And what we want to avoid is these systemic collapses. Because what we've seen so far, the climate impacts that I've walked through in our region so far, like these are small things we can adapt to, we can manage. You're like, okay, that was a bad season, that was a bad summer. Okay, we can work around these. What we're facing potentially is systemic civilization collapse as systems fail. And I think we all have a little bit of a lived experience of what that can look like. Think about early pandemic and everyone's scramble to find toilet paper. It's a little bit silly, but imagine it's not toilet paper, but wheat and corn or fuel for your vehicles or to live your life, energy, fundamentally energy. That will lead to, if we have those kinds of systemic collapses of systems, food systems, of governance, the kinds of, like, we're not talking about economics anymore. This is like systemic collapse. And that's the thing that we're worried about. And what we have to avoid, and that's what we're trying to avoid by keeping temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, or hopefully, I mean, I think 1.5 degrees Celsius is maybe out of reach at this point. This is a paper in Nature from Gavin Schmidt. He was at NASA. He's one of the top scientists working on global temperatures and climate models. This came out just a few weeks ago, and it really struck me. The things that he was saying in this editorial was published in Nature. And he was talking about how climate models can't explain the heat that we saw in 2023. And he said that the temperature anomalies has come out of the blue, revealing an unprecedented knowledge gap. When some of the world's top scientists say there's an unprecedented knowledge gap, that is a problem. It could imply that a warming planet is already fundamentally altering how the climate system operates much sooner than we had anticipated. It could also mean that statistical inferences based on past events are less reliable than we thought, adding more uncertainty to seasonal predictions of droughts and rainfall patterns. Risks, uncertainty, affecting systemic systems. The challenge that we're facing now is that there are two very different realities. And if you get stuck in either one of those, if you spend a predominant amount of your time in either one of those realities, you can be disempowered. And what we need is action. So the challenge is holding both of these realities. And as you talk to others, helping others understand that there's both of these realities. We need to harness the urgency and leadership and optimism to drive action at the scale and pace necessary. So this is where I think we are. This is one of the ways, another one of the ways I think about it. Today, there are barriers, very high barriers to climate solutions, but they're starting to fall. We're seeing declining prices. We're seeing adoption of technologies. And at the same time, we're seeing a steady but increasing rise of climate impacts. And I intentionally put climate impacts in the low end right now because what we're seeing are very minor climate impacts in terms of what we expect to see in the future. But they're going up. Today, what I like to call it is we are in the implementation decade. We need to shift how we think about problems. No longer is it possible to think like, can we even electrify our home? Does that even work? Do heat pumps work? Like that's old thinking. We need to shift our frame of reference and say, I'm electrifying my home. What's my first step? Because there's actually a lot of steps to do it. You need to check your electrical panel, you need to repair, you need to think about the age of your current appliances, because the best time to replace it is when they go bad. The old way of thinking about this, and I think CCL has really helped me understand this, is okay, when are national Democrats gonna fix the climate challenge? Like somebody else is gonna fix it, like, you know. And we need to shift our thinking and say, when can my state and federal representatives, regardless of party, act on climate? Everybody needs to be in this. And as we move forward through this, eventually we're gonna cross a tipping point. Now, this tipping point can occur on a personal level. It aggregates up to societal level. And we need to help each other at understanding where this tipping point is and crossing over it. So, and what I mean by this is like, so at some point, like the barriers to climate solutions are declining. It's just going to be easier. Like, oh man, my electric vehicle is more fun to drive. It's easier to drive. It's more convenient. I just plug it in at home. My home is, well sealed and it's really comfortable with this electric heat pump. Those barriers are declining. And also we're seeing these climate impacts increasing. You're like, man, I just don't feel right about, using this fossil fuel energy for energy. I want to use something that's all electric and much cleaner, more efficient. And eventually we're going to get to a stable climate and a sustainable climate. And it doesn't mean that all of our problems are solved. Like we're still going to face lots of other problems, but we need to get to this point where this big one is more manageable. And I think in the near future, this is the way I think about it. And I'm still workshopping this, so I'm curious to hear if you have feedback. But burning fossil fuels would be the technological equivalent of vinyl and the moral equivalent of smoking in the very near future. And the way I get a lot of feedback that vinyl is maybe not the best example to use because, vinyl has a resurgence right now. A lot of people want to like collect vinyl and listen to it. Like it's cool, right? I don't ever expect that. What's that? VHS, yeah. I don't ever expect that vehicles that are powered by some sort of fuel will go away. Like there's always going to be the classic Mustang muscle car. And like some people are going to have them and they're going to, they're probably going to have some zero carbon fuel or net zero fuel that's made from synthetic fuels. They can like take that car and drive it around the park, once a year when they're showing off their classic cars. Those are going to exist. I don't have a problem with that. Like those are classic things, but their daily driver is going to be powered by electricity. I guarantee you. And people that really like to have vinyl, like that's great. That's a collector's item. And, and it sounds, it's a little classic. It has this, characteristic sound, just like a motor might. But when they, like they're on the bus or, on the subway going to work or in their car, they're not listening to their vinyl record because it's more convenient. You have streaming music. It's like iTunes, right? Or Spotify. So that's where that comparison comes from. I don't know, maybe it's not the perfect comparison. If you have a better idea, I'm happy to hear it. Really, this is fundamentally about communicating. Your task as you talk to policymakers and your friends and family and folks in across your life is to listen what concerns them, because I have found, as I've started to understand this way of thinking about these two realities we're facing, I find that people often get stuck in one or the other, or they feel one or the other more urgently and think about it and spend a lot of time. And what they need is the opposite. They need to get both of these. And so your task is to listen to what concerns people. Where do they often land? Help them understand that there are two divergent realities. And it's important to listen to them because both of these things are happening, and it's important not to discount that reality. Because people will, when you acknowledge their experience of reality, that helps them, makes them feel heard. And they're like, okay, great. I can see that you understand where I'm coming from. And then they're more willing to listen to maybe the other perspective. Some people resonate with the urgency of climate change and all of the climate impacts that we're seeing. They need to understand that there's opportunity in climate solutions and that we have to act on them and scale them up quickly. We can't just think like, oh, it's too late. We've already screwed up the planet and all hope is lost. And I would say in general, as a stereotype, this is more stereotypically young people feel the urgency of the climate challenge and feel like hope is lost. They need to hear the message that there is a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of things going on in terms of climate solutions. Conversely, some people resonate with the opportunity of climate solutions, and they spend all of their time thinking about like, oh man, we've got all this great technology, it's scaling up around the world, it's awesome. The risk of spending too much time there is you become a techno-optimist, and that these things are just scaling up, we don't need to worry about it, it's being taken care of. And they need to understand that there's urgency, that we're not meeting where we need to be in terms of emission reductions yet. We need to actually keep going and reduce our emissions even further. We need more action, and it's urgent, and time is not on our side. As a generalization, I would put a lot of policymakers in this bucket, especially conservative policymakers. So I think it's also an opportunity to think about where you land and think about what message you often resonate with, where you spend most of your time, and what things might be helpful for you, for your own mental health and for your own empowerment, what message you need to look into. And I really like this quote from, so Utah, one of the other things that I've done as a professor at the University of Utah is I've looked into the history of air quality in Utah. Utah actually has a really long and very fascinating history because we live in a bowl, and we used to burn coal for all of our energy, and our air quality used to be atrocious. And there was a lot of work that was done to improve air quality over the last century. And so this is a quote from 1926. This was somebody from the U.S. Bureau of Mines who was looking at the policies that were in place. There was a big study in the winter of 1919 to 1920 in Salt Lake. It was one of the first major air quality studies done in the country, was done in Salt Lake City. And they implemented a bunch of local policies to try to improve local air quality. And then they went back, 5 years later and did an assessment of like, how's it working? And one of the things they noticed, like one of the policies they had in place was they paid people to stand on top of buildings and look out over the city. And when they saw big plumes of smoke coming from factories, they'd, get on the phone and say, hey, so-and-so, your boiler is not operating correctly, fix it, or we're going to fine you. And then they'd go and they'd fix it. Like, okay, great. And actually improved a lot. But then they ran out of money and that program went away. And all of a sudden, air quality got much worse. And so that's where this quote comes from. Continuous, never ceasing effort is required to clean up a smoky city. Smoky just refers to poor air quality there. A few months of relaxation and years of effort are canceled. And this applies to air quality, also applies to climate change. When people say like, oh, we had a really good winter snowpack, we don't need to worry about reducing our emissions, everything's going to be fine. We need to have continuous, never ceasing efforts for the next several decades on this issue to keep reducing our emissions. And even when we reduce our emissions, we need to say, okay, how to reduce emissions even more? The faster we can get down to a lower global emissions rate is where we need to be in terms of a stable and safe climate system. So we've got a few minutes now. And so what I'd like to do, we've got maybe 10 minutes. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to have you all pair up and talk about, I want you each to talk about where you typically land. Which of these realities do you typically spend most of your time in? And just talk about your experience of that. Have you had conversations with folks that would benefit from this kind of framework? So let's do that for a few minutes, and I'll come back in like 5 or 8 minutes, and then we'll share a few insights that you might have gained, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Where do deniers fit in?
That's a good question. Have a conversation about it. All right. I'd like to come back to the group, and if you have any thoughts you'd like to share with the group, I don't know, Marks, you got the microphone. If there are any thoughts you'd like to share, something interesting came up in your conversations, I'd love to hear it, or feedback or experiences.
Very
Do you have kids, Logan?
No.
Okay, I'm a 12-year-old.
Okay.
And wow, I am so scared. Am I going to die in 10 years because of climate change? My parents don't really believe in it, and they're not doing anything about it. And, you know, the person who's just, well, so my question to you is, what is your response based on your thoughts about being too much of an opportunist and balancing it with urgency? How are you going to respond to this 12-year-old?
How would you respond? Yeah. Yeah. So my response is to validate their feelings. They're feeling something that is absolutely real. We are facing an existential crisis right now. That is real. I don't want them to think that if they think that you don't understand that, they're not going to listen to what you say next. And that's true of legislators and policymakers. If you don't understand where they're coming from, they won't listen to what you have to say next. And then you can talk about all of the amazing things that we're seeing. I mean, I said this earlier, the scale of clean energy deployments are at, it's like we're going through the Industrial Revolution in a matter of a couple of decades. It is fundamentally changing the shape of the earth and how we interact, and how society operates. It's a fundamental shift, and it's going to happen really fast. That brings a lot of fear and a lot of pendulum swings. So one of the things that I think that's happened here this year in Utah with our legislative session, we had a really tough legislative session here in Utah, a lot of backsliding in terms of climate policy and energy policy. It's a pendulum swing. And that, you know, as you get older, as I get older, I'm understanding that there's pendulum swings, but that we're moving in a continuous direction. It's just like, you know, like you don't look where the dog is walking, you look at where the person is walking who's holding the leash. We're moving in a consistent direction. That's true with temperatures, but it's also true with policy. Is that helpful? A little bit?
I am by nature a climate opportunity guy. And the right-leaning audience that I'm mostly communicating with or trying to communicate with also respond much better to climate opportunity messaging. I think you're right that I need more climate urgency in my messaging. And the question is, do you have suggestions on how to do that in ways that they can hear it?
That is a good question, and it's a tough one coming from you, Tom. But I think that's fundamentally the point, though, is that we need to figure out the messages that respond to them. I think it is focusing on things that they care about. I mean, the meta theme is finding common ground with somebody and then pushing them a little bit and moving the needle. Like, you don't need to move them from, you know, climate denier to, you know, activist. You need to move them one step of the way. And having conversations is how you do that. And this is a framework to understand how to have a conversation with folks and how to move them one step of the way. And for those of us who are working in more conservative states, which there are many in our region, and conservative legislators, it's important to find something we can agree on and then try to move that. So I think the message is to understand, like, okay, naturally, you and I have an inclination to really focus on the climate opportunity and all of the cool things that are happening. It is really important to pepper in the urgency messages and find and try different things. Like, hey, the IRA is passed and that's great, but in order to actually recognize all of the emission reduction potential, we need permitting reform. And we're off track in terms of our emission reduction targets. If we don't have permitting reform, we're not going to make it. So I think that there are different ways of doing it, but I think it is absolutely important to have both of those messages. Oh, are we at it? Okay, Bill says.
No, I have a comment before you want to. I don't have a question. I have a comment. So the bad news is, and the good news is, there continues to be a purpose for climate advocates, and there continues to be a purpose for CCL.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, let's into that. That's great. All right. Yeah, I'll be out if we want to have, if you have any questions for me, I'll be out here. And I think Bill's cutting us off, and we're moving on to the next thing.
Thank you, Logan. Sorry to be running such a tight ship here. It's great to have you here, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. So we're now going to have a 15-minute break. And before we go, I just wanted to really talk about a couple of the actions that we're really trying to focus on. You know, on the national level, we have the 25,000 climate conversations, and that's really something that I would love all of us as volunteers to really contribute to. And all that information can be found on CCL. But specifically, we have a really important action that we're working on for our region too that has a bit of a Utah focus, and that is the postcarding that we have. And we have an audacious goal of getting 5,000 postcards mailed to low propensity voters in Utah for the primaries. And this is really important, as we saw with Representative Curtis here. We have this amazing opportunity to help support getting voters to the voting booth. And so we would love to ask people, we have, I think Aaron Massover has agreed to take 300, I heard. So yeah, Aaron, way to go. We'd love to see if anyone wants to beat Aaron in that number. 350. Do I hear 400? 400. Do I hear 400? But we have packets, or not packets, we have groupings of 100 postcards, and we would love to invite anyone who can help out by taking 100, or if you can take more, we'd love to have that. These will need to be mailed on June 4th. We also are, obviously with 5,000 postcards, that's about $2,500 in stamps. And so if you're able to cover the stamps to help out, that would be great. But we don't want that to be a barrier for you. So if you need help with that, we want to help with that. And if you want to contribute to the postcards, we've got the postcard contribution jar out on the table there. And so if you have an interest and want to help, please go to that back table where the ladies are. They've been counting out the postcards, and I may target you on the breaks. So please bear with me. This is a really important opportunity that we want to take full advantage of. And with that, the sessions will start at 10:10. And so the What is Decarbonization breakout will be in this room. And the Making Advocacy Super Fun will be in room 316, and in 320, Clean Energy, It's Happening with Mark Peterson will be in room 320. So thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to the rest of the day. After the breakout sessions, there'll be another 15-minute break, and then we'll have the keynote with Ben Abbott from BYU. So please stick with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you for the rest of the day.